The desert night held no moon. Only cold stars hung over the Arizona sky. Far off on the northern ridge, torches bloomed without warning, one, then a dozen, then more. They moved slow and sure, like a noose tightening around the quiet land below. Dust rose under unhurried hooves. The sound carried clear across the dark. No one tried to hide it. A lone ranch stood still in the open. The porch was black. A figure waited behind the wooden rail, rifle already raised. A finger rested lightly on the trigger. The first tin can rattle distant faint, but enough to lock every muscle tight. Then the second, then the third. Dark shapes poured down from the ridge. Torches flared bright. The first shot tore the night apart. The sun did not rise over Caleb Whitfield's ranch. It arrived, slow, deliberate, like it had somewhere better to be, and was only stopping by out of habit. He was already awake before it. Always was. 45 years old, and his body had stopped asking permission to wake at 4. It just did, eyes open. Ceiling boards above him, the same 11 boards he had counted every morning for 5 years now, 11. Never 10, never 12. Just 11 boards and a silence so complete, he could hear his own heartbeat arguing with it. He got up, because that was the only thing to do. The floor was cold under his feet, and the cabin smelled the way it always smelled. Wood smoke gone stale. Leather. A little bit of dust that never fully settled. No matter how many times he swept, he dressed in the dark. Didn't need light for it. His hands knew the buttons better than his eyes did. Downstairs, the stove sat cold, waiting. He built the fire the way his father taught him, and his father's father before that. Small pieces. Fate used to say. Father used to say patience is the only ingredient fire respects. Caleb struck the match, watched the flame itch, watched it grow, and thought, not for the first time, that a fire was the only thing in this house that still needed him. Always coffee first. He drank it standing at the window, looking out at land that belonged to him on paper and to no one in his heart. Fences stretching toward the horizon, cattle moving slow and stupid across dry grass. Mountains in the distance, purple in the early light, indifferent to whatever a man was going through down here at their feet. 5 years, since Ruth's cough had turned into something the doctor in Dry Wells couldn't name, and then into something no one could stop. 5 years since he'd stood at a grave marker he'd carved himself because he trusted his own hands more than a stranger's, and said words he couldn't remember now. Not because they weren't important, because grief does that. Steals the words and leaves you only the shape of having said them. He didn't think about her every morning. Except he did. Except that wasn't quite true either, because thinking implied a choice and there was no choosing involved. She was just there, in the coffee cup she used to fill for him, in the second chair at the table he never moved, in the quiet that used to have her humming in it and now just had quiet. He finished the coffee, set the cup down, and went to work, because work was the only prayer he still knew how to say properly. He passed the garden on his way to the barn, Ruth's garden. He still called it that, even now, even though nothing grew there anymore, except the hardy things that didn't need a woman's hands to survive. She'd planted it the first spring they'd had the place, on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and a look on her face like she was building something that would outlast both of them. It hadn't. Not the garden. Not her. He remembered the last good week. Before the cough turned into something worse. Before the doctor's face started doing that careful thing doctors' faces do when they're choosing which truths to tell you and which ones to let you find on your own. She'd been sitting right there, in that same dirt, laughing at something he'd said. He couldn't remember what. That was the cruelest part of it some days. Not the dying. The forgetting of the small things, the ordinary things, the jokes in the mornings and the sound of her voice calling him in for supper. He remembered the big things fine. Just not always the small ones. And it was always the small ones a man found himself reaching for at 4 in the morning when the house was too quiet and his own heartbeat was the loudest thing in it. He didn't visit her grave every day. Told himself that was healthy. Told himself a man couldn't spend his whole life talking to a wooden marker and calling it a marriage. But he passed it most mornings on the way to the north pasture, and most mornings he found some reason to stop. Today it was a weed grown up too close to the base of the stone. He knelt, pulled it, set it aside. "Morning," he said. Quiet. Out of habit more than belief in anyone hearing it. He didn't say anything else, didn't need to. 5 years of mornings like this one had worn the ritual down to its simplest shape: a few words, a moment of stillness, and then the rest of the day waiting to be lived, whether he felt ready for it or not. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and went to work. The horses first, then the fences, then the cattle, counted and recounted, though he knew the number before he started. Force of habit. A man alone learns to trust rituals more than memory, because memory has a way of softening at the edges when there's no one else around to sharpen it against. He was checking the west fence line when he heard the horse coming. Not urgent, not fast. Just a horse walking with a man who wasn't in any particular hurry, which in this country usually meant one of two things. Either trouble hadn't found him yet, or the man riding didn't think it counted as trouble. Walter Pruitt came around the ridge with his hat pulled low and his mustache doing that thing it did when he was about to say something he considered important. Whitfield. Walter. Fence holding? Fence is fine. Walter nodded like that settled something, though it hadn't been in question. He sat his horse a moment. Looked out at the same mountains Caleb had been looking at all morning, then got to it the way Walter always eventually got to it. You hear about Miller's place? No. Lost 6 head, middle of the night. Gone. Wolves? Wolves don't cut fence, Caleb. That landed the way it was meant to land. Caleb kept working, kept his hands on the wire, because sometimes the only way to hear something all the way through was to keep your hands busy while you did it. Apache, Walter said, like the word itself was evidence, like saying it proved something. You see them? Didn't have to. Then how do you know? Because who else is it going to be? Walter's voice had an edge now. Not at Caleb. At the world, maybe. At the fear he'd been carrying around like a second horse he couldn't put down. Everybody in town saying the same thing. Bands moving through since the fighting started up again near the river. Desperate people do desperate things, Caleb. You know that better than most. I know hungry people do hungry things, Caleb said. Doesn't make them thieves. Doesn't make them not thieves either. Silence sat between them for a moment. Comfortable in the way old arguments are comfortable, because you both know the shape of them by now and don't need to raise your voice to fill it. Walter dismounted after a while, leaned against the fence post watching Caleb work, the way he'd watched him work 100 times before, ever since they'd both staked their claims out here within a year of each other, two strangers becoming something like friends out of nothing but proximity and stubbornness. You remember the Hendersons, Walter said. Of course I remember the Hendersons. Whole family, gone in one night, 4 years back. You remember how that started too? Somebody being neighborly. Somebody deciding a stranger passing through deserved the benefit of the doubt. That was a different situation, Walter. Was it? Yes. How do you figure? Caleb straightened up from the wire, wiped his brow with the back of his wrist. Because the men who did that to the Hendersons were white outlaws wearing borrowed blankets, trying to make it look like something it wasn't. You know that as well as I do. Sheriff proved it eventually. Walter's jaw tightened. Proved it after the fact. Doesn't change what it felt like beforehand. Doesn't change what folks believed for 2 full months while it was happening. No, Caleb admitted, it doesn't. That's my point. Your point is that fear doesn't need to be right to feel true. My point, Walter said, is that you can't always just wait around to find out which kind of stranger you're dealing with before you decide how careful to be. Some men don't get a second chance to learn that lesson. Caleb considered that. There was truth in it, buried somewhere under the fear Walter carried around like a second horse. He just wasn't sure it was the whole truth. Rarely was with fear. It borrowed just enough fact to make itself sound reasonable, and left out everything that might complicate the borrowing. You're too soft for this country, Walter said finally, not unkindly. Always have been. War should have fixed that. War fixes plenty of things, Caleb said. Softness isn't usually one of the casualties. Walter almost smiled at that, almost. If they come around your place, he said, gathering his reins, you run them off. Quick, before it turns into something. That's the only way this territory stays livable. You wait too long to decide what a stranger is, and sometimes the deciding gets done for you. Understand? I hear you, Walter. That's not the same as agreeing with me. No, Caleb said. It isn't. Walter rode off shaking his head the way he always did after these conversations, like Caleb was a puzzle he'd given up solving years ago, but still couldn't stop looking at. Caleb watched him go and went back to the fence because the wire didn't care about any of it. The wire just needed fixing, and fixing was simple, and simple was something he could still manage on a morning like this one. He'd heard it all before, not just from Walter. From half the men in Dry Wells, from the saloon talk that drifted out the door when it swung open, from women at the Mercantile lowering their voices like the walls themselves might report back to somebody dangerous. Stories about raids, stolen horses, a rancher 2 counties over found dead, though nobody agreed on how, and everybody agreed on who to blame before the facts had even finished arriving. Caleb had learned a long time ago that fear traveled faster than truth always had, probably always would, because he'd seen it during the war too. He didn't talk about the war. Not with Walter. Not with anyone in town. It sat in him the way a scar sits under a shirt, always there, never mentioned, only felt on the cold mornings when the old wounds ached for no particular reason. He'd scouted for the Union. 3 years of it. Learned to read tracks the way some men read scripture, carefully, and with the understanding that a wrong interpretation could get somebody killed. Learned that the men who screamed the loudest about the enemy were usually the ones who'd spent the least time actually looking one in the eye. He'd looked plenty of men in the eye during those years. Some of them had been exactly what the stories said. Cruel, dangerous, worth every bit of the fear that followed them. And some of them had just been scared boys a long way from home, doing what scared boys do when somebody hands them a rifle and tells them, "The world is simple." He'd never forgotten the difference, which was maybe why he couldn't make himself hate a people he'd never actually met. Not because he was naive. Walter was wrong about that part. Because he'd learned, the hard way, in places he still didn't talk about, that the stories men told each other around fires were rarely the same as the truth standing in front of them. There was one memory in particular. He didn't take it out often. Didn't like the taste it left. But it surfaced sometimes. Uninvited, a supply column ambushed outside a town whose name he'd long since let go of. And afterward, the argument among his own men about what to do with the prisoners they'd taken. Some wanted blood, simple as that. An eye for an eye, and no patience left for anything more complicated. One man hadn't agreed. A young lieutenant, calm in a way that made the shouting around him look foolish by comparison, who'd stood between the prisoners and the men who wanted them dead, and said, quiet, steady, that killing men who'd already surrendered wasn't soldiering. It was just murder wearing a uniform. Caleb had believed him, still did all these years later, but he also remembered the other men in that column, the ones who'd sneered at the lieutenant's mercy, who'd gone on afterward to build reputations for themselves that had nothing to do with mercy. At all men who collected certain kinds of weapons the way other men collected watches or good boots, prizing the ones that did the most damage, that announced themselves the loudest in a wound. He'd known 2 or 3 men like that during the war. Had steered clear of all of them, the way you steer clear of anything you recognize as rot before it spreads. He hadn't thought about any of that in years. Didn't know yet why it had risen up in him again this particular morning, unbidden, while he stood mending a fence under an ordinary Arizona sky. So he kept his opinions to himself, mostly, and let the fence mending speak for him instead. He'd been in Dry Wells 3 days back for supplies, and the memory of it sat with him still, an aftertaste he couldn't quite rinse away. The mercantile had been full of the same talk. Walter carried out to the ranch on horseback talk that traveled faster than truth, the way it always did in a town this small, this frightened, this far from anything resembling real law. A rancher's wife had lowered her voice at the counter, though not low enough, and said something about a war party seen near the river crossing. Nobody had actually seen it. Everybody repeated it anyway, each retelling a little more certain than the last, until a rumor with no witness at all had hardened into something the whole town treated as fact. Caleb had said nothing, paid for his flour, left. Outside, he'd run into the sheriff, a decent enough man named Boone, tired around the eyes in the particular way of someone who'd taken on more territory than any one badge could reasonably cover. "Quiet trip, I hope," Boone had said. "Mostly. Keep it that way. Things are stirred up right now. More than usual. Things are always stirred up around here, Boone." Boone had almost smiled at that. Fair point. Then, softer, glancing back toward the mercantile where the voices still carried through the open door. "Folks are scared, Caleb. Scared people don't always reason straight. You understand that better than most, I'd think, given where you've been." "I understand it," Caleb had said. "It doesn't mean I like watching it happen twice." He'd ridden home with that conversation sitting heavy in him, the whole long way back, past ranches whose owners waved and called out friendly enough, and past others whose owners watched him pass with the particular wariness of men who'd decided, somewhere along the line, that wariness itself was a kind of virtue. He hadn't agreed with them then. Didn't agree with them now, standing at his fence line with Walter's warning still ringing faint in his ears. The afternoon came in hot. Hotter than usual for spring, the kind of heat that made the horizon shimmer and turn liquid, so the distant things looked like they were standing in water that wasn't there. Caleb had finished the west fence and moved on to the corral gate, which had been hanging crooked since a storm 2 weeks back. He liked this kind of work. Simple, physical, The kind of problem that had an actual solution, unlike most of the problems a man his age carried around. He had the hinge half off when his horse tied nearby, cropping at what grass there was, lifted its head sharp, ears forward. A snort that meant something, though Caleb couldn't have said what yet. He straightened up, wiped his hands on his trousers, looked west. At first, there was nothing but heat and distance, the kind of nothing the desert specialized in, so total it made a man doubt his own eyes. Then, shapes. Small, dark against the shimmer, moving slow. Travelers, he thought first. Just travelers. Except something in the way they moved wasn't right. Too slow, too uneven. The gait of people who had been walking a long time and had stopped believing the walking would end. He watched them a while longer, and felt his chest tighten in that old familiar way. The scout's instinct still alive in him after all these years of pretending it had gone quiet. Assess first, decide second. Never the other way around. He walked to the porch, picked up the rifle leaning there, didn't raise it, just held it. Because a man who'd learned anything from 3 years of war learned this: above everything else, you prepare before you ask questions, and you ask questions before you ever pull a trigger. The dog he didn't have would have been barking by now. He almost missed having one. In that strange sideways way grief sometimes reached for company that wasn't even there anymore. Just him. Just the yard and the heat and 4 shapes crossing land that belonged, on paper, entirely to him, and belonged in every practical sense to no one at all. The figures kept coming. He counted his own heartbeats without meaning to. A habit from the war that had never fully left him measuring time in something steadier than a watch, something that couldn't be wound down or left behind on a nightstand. 1, 2, 3. The wind shifted, carried a little dust across the yard, across his boots, and he squinted against it without looking away from the ridge. 4, 5. Walter's voice again, unbidden. Chase them off, before trouble follows. 6, 7. His thumb found the hammer of the rifle and rested there, not cocking it, just finding it. The way a man finds a doorframe in the dark, not because he means to use it, but because knowing it's there is its own kind of comfort. Closer now. Close enough that the shimmer stopped hiding them, 4 of them. And Caleb Whitfield felt something in his stomach go very still. He could make out details now. An old man in front, moving with the careful economy of someone conserving every last bit of strength he had left. Behind him, a woman about the same age, her hand occasionally finding his shoulder, not for support exactly, more like reassurance, the kind 2 people give each other after 50 years of needing very little of it. Behind them, a younger woman, moving steady though her steps had the same worn quality as the others, and beside her a young man, barely more than a boy in the face, though his shoulders had a warrior's set to them even now, even exhausted. He was favoring his left arm, holding it close to his body in the particular way people hold an injury they don't want you to notice. No weapons raised. No weapons visible at all. In fact, beyond what might have been a knife at the old man's belt, the kind every traveler in this country carried for skinning game and cutting rope, not for war. Clothing torn, faces burned by days of open sun, waterskins that hung too light, too flat, the unmistakable shape of empty. They were Apache. Caleb knew that from the first clear look, and every warning Walter Pruitt had ever given him rose up in his chest at once, loud, insistent, familiar. Chase them off, before trouble follows. His hand tightened on the rifle, because that was the safe thing, the smart thing, the thing every rancher in 3 counties would have told him to do without a second's hesitation. Raise it. Shout a warning. Watch them turn back the way they came. Except what if they didn't turn back? What if they couldn't? Look at him. Just look. That wasn't the walk of men planning trouble. That was the walk of people with nothing left to plan with at all. Do it anyway, some old wartime voice in him said. Don't wait to find out which one they are. That's how men get killed. That's how it's always gone. Except he'd heard that voice give bad advice before, heard it convince better men than him to do worse things than this. And he was so tired of letting a voice built entirely out of fear make his decisions for him. His thumb found the hammer, didn't cock it, just found it. Rested there. Walter's face flashed up in his mind unbidden, mouth already shaping the word he'd use later if this went wrong. Soft. That was the word. Too soft for this country. Maybe he was. Except softness had never once gotten him killed. Fear had nearly done it a dozen times over, back when he wore a different uniform and carried a different rifle, and hadn't yet learned the difference between caution and cowardice, dressed up as caution. Except the old man in front had both hands raised now, palms out, empty. Not a gesture of aggression. The opposite. A gesture as old as human beings meeting each other across distance and fear. I carry nothing. I mean you no harm. And the young woman beside the wounded boy had her arm looped through his, steadying him, the way you steady someone you love, more than you're willing to say out loud. Caleb stood on his porch with a rifle in his hands, and a decision closing in on him faster than he was ready for. The old man stopped several yards from the house, close enough to speak, far enough to show he understood the danger of coming any closer without permission. He said something Caleb didn't catch, low, maybe, to the others behind him. Then, in English broke, careful, each word stones across a river he wasn't sure would hold his weight. We mean no trouble. Caleb didn't answer right away. The rifle was still in his hands, not raised, not lowered either, sitting in that terrible middle place where a man's whole future sometimes balances. Water, the old man said. We ask only for water. Behind him, the wounded young man swayed slightly, caught himself. The young woman's grip on his arm tightened. Caleb's mind was doing the thing it always did in moments like this, running through every possibility, at once, fast, almost violent in its speed. They could be scouts for something larger. They could be exactly what they looked like. They could be desperate enough to turn dangerous. The second his guard dropped, they could die of thirst 40 feet from his well if he didn't, because that last one kept surfacing no matter how many times he tried to push it back down. 40 feet. That was all that stood between these people and water, enough to keep walking. 40 feet and a rifle, and every story Walter Pruitt had ever told him standing between them like a wall he'd half built himself out of other men's fear. You're a long way from anywhere, Caleb said. Testing. Watching for the flinch, the tell, whatever might reveal a lie underneath the words. There was none. Our village, the old man said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, just slight, the kind of crack that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. Gone. Days now. We walk since. Gone how? The old man's eyes held his. Steady, even through the exhaustion. Fighting, he said. Simple. Final. Like the word contained more than he had strength left to explain. Caleb studied him a long moment. Studied all of them. The old woman whose hand had never left her husband's shoulder. The young woman with her fierce, protective grip on the wounded man beside her. The wounded man himself, upright through sheer will. Eyes fixed somewhere, past Caleb, toward the well he could probably smell before he could see it. None of them looked like the stories. They looked like people who had been walking through hell and hadn't eaten in longer than any of them would likely admit it. Caleb lowered the rifle. Not all the way. Not yet. Some habits took longer to unlearn than a single afternoon allowed, but lowered enough that the message was clear. You've got a name, he asked. Toya, the old man said. He placed a hand briefly against his chest. This is Sella. The old woman inclined her head slightly. The younger woman, watching Caleb with an expression that gave away nothing, and noticed everything, and Chody, the wounded man, who nodded once, jaw tight against whatever pain he was carrying in that arm. My sister's son, Caleb Whitfield, he said, and felt strange saying it, felt the whole moment tilt sideways into something he hadn't prepared for, because you didn't exchange names with an enemy, which meant, somewhere in the last minute, without quite deciding to, he'd stopped treating them like one. He set the rifle against the porch rail, walked toward the well without another word because words felt insufficient to whatever was happening, and his hands wanted something useful to do. The rope creaked. The bucket dropped. He hauled it up, cool water sloshing over the rim, and filled the tin cups he kept hanging by the well handle for exactly this kind of ordinary use cattle work, hot afternoons. Nothing that had ever mattered the way this moment mattered. He carried the cups out to them himself. They drank carefully. That was the thing that struck him hardest, watching it happen. Not desperately, the way he might have expected from people who'd clearly gone without for days. Carefully. Slowly. Sella drank only a little before passing her cup back toward Toya, murmuring something low. Ituha did the same with Chody, tilting the cup gently toward his mouth. When his own hand shook too much to manage it steady, Caleb reefed the cups without being asked, and refilled them again. Somewhere around the third trip to the well, he stopped thinking of it as a decision he was making, and started thinking of it as simply the thing that needed doing next. He watched Chody's hand tremble around the cup, watched the arm he held so carefully against his ribs. There was blood there, dried dark against torn fabric, old enough that it had stopped being an emergency and become instead a slow, grinding kind of danger, the kind that killed men days later, quietly from infection instead of the wound itself. That needs looking at, Caleb said. Chody's eyes flicked to him, wary. I've set worse, Caleb, during the war. I'm not much of a doctor, but I know enough not to make it worse. Toya said something to Chody in their own language. Lowen, whatever it was, seemed to settle something, because the young man's shoulders eased half an inch, and he nodded. All right, Caleb said. Come sit. He brought out clean cloth. Whiskey, though not much enough to clean a wound, not enough to be mistaken for hospitality he couldn't yet afford to offer freely. He worked carefully, the way he'd worked on a dozen wounded men in a war that felt both 100 years ago and close enough to touch. Chody didn't flinch when the whiskey hit the wound. Didn't make a sound at all. Actually, which told Caleb something about the kind of man, the kind of boy, really, because up close, he couldn't have been more than 20 he was dealing with. The bullet had gone clean through the meat of the shoulder. Missed the bone, from what Caleb could tell without proper instruments. Lucky in the narrow way any bullet wound could be called lucky. Caleb was reaching for the cloth to bind it when something made him stop. Made him look closer. The wound itself, the way the flesh had torn on entry, the particular pattern of it, he'd seen that pattern before. Not often. Not from ordinary rifles, the kind most ranchers and soldiers carried, from something else. Something specific. A weapon he'd seen only a handful of times. Years ago, carried by a small number of men in his own unit, men who'd wanted something with more stopping power than the standard issue, and had gone to considerable trouble and expense to get it. He sat back on his heels. Something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the desert heat, because that kind of weapon wasn't common, wasn't something a man picked up at any general store on any dusty street in the territory. It was rare, expensive. The kind of thing a certain type of man carried, the kind who valued the extra damage it did, who wanted his targets to know exactly what had hit them. He thought, for one unwelcome second, of that supply column, of the men who'd sneered at mercy, of one man in particular, a face he hadn't let himself picture in years, and wasn't ready to picture now either, so he shoved it back down where it had been living, quiet, for the better part of a decade. It's nothing, he told himself. Plenty of men owned weapons like that. Plenty of men had passed through this territory since the war ended, carrying whatever they'd carried home with them. Except how many? Really? How many men had he actually known to carry that exact weapon? He didn't let himself finish the count. Who did this? Caleb said. Quiet. Not quite a question. Chody's jaw tightened. Toya answered instead, his voice low and careful, like a man setting down something fragile. Men, he said. White men. With guns like nothing we've seen before. Caleb's hands had gone still around the cloth. How many? Many, Toya said. They came at night. Burned the lodges, took the horses. Some of our people. He stopped. Started again, the words costing him visibly. Some did not run fast enough or on foot. Riders, many horses. More than we could count in the dark. Did they say anything? Call out anything? A name. Toya's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him, the same careful measuring look from earlier, sharper now. Why do you ask this? Because I might know something about the guns, Caleb said, and hated how true it felt saying it out loud. You know these men. I don't know, Caleb said. Honest. Not for certain. Maybe nothing at all. Just a feeling I'd rather be wrong about. Toya held his gaze a moment longer. Then let it go. Some old caution deciding, apparently, that this was not a lie. No name, he said. Only laughter and the guns. The silence that followed had weight to it. Real weight. The kind that pressed against a man's chest and made breathing feel like a decision. Caleb finished binding the wound with hands that weren't quite steady anymore. Not from fear, from recognition. From the slow, sick certainty settling into his gut that whatever had happened to this family, whatever had burned their village and put a bullet through this young man's shoulder, wasn't the work of strangers, doing what strangers sometimes did in a violent country. It was the work of someone who knew exactly what kind of weapon did the most damage. Someone who'd learned that, the way Caleb himself had learned it, in the war. He didn't say any of that out loud. Not yet. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like a wild guess dressed up as a fact, and he'd learned a long time ago not to hand people conclusions before he'd earned the right to them. So he finished the bandage, tied it off clean, and said, Only that'll hold if you're careful with it. Chody flexed his fingers experimentally, nodded once. It was the closest thing to thanks the young man seemed willing to offer yet, and Caleb understood that too, understood the particular pride of someone unwilling to owe a stranger more than the moment required. He straightened up, looked out at the four of them, gathered now in the thin shade near his porch, and felt the day tilting further away from anything Walter Pruitt would have recognized as sensible. Because water and a bandage were one thing, and there they were, standing in front of him, clearly having had neither food nor rest in longer than any of them would admit. He thought about the cattle, about the cost of every animal on this land, counted in months of labor, and years of careful breeding, the kind of math a rancher does without thinking, because it's the difference between surviving winter and not. And thought too about the boy's cracked knuckles wrapped up in tin cup like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "You'll eat something before you go on," he said. It wasn't a question. He hadn't meant it to be. Toya studied him a long moment, the kind of look that seemed to be measuring something beyond the words themselves, measuring the man behind them, weighing whether the offer was real or only the beginning of some trap he hadn't seen the shape of yet. Whatever he found in Caleb's face seemed to satisfy him. "We would be grateful," he said simply. Caleb walked to the pen where his cattle grazed, indifferent to the weight of the decision about to fall on one of them. He looked them over the way he always did, assessing weight, health, the particular economics of a working ranch, where every animal was a promise made to the coming winter. He chose the healthiest steer he had. Not the sick one, not the old one nobody would miss. The healthiest, because half a gesture wasn't a gesture at all. It was just guilt dressed up as generosity, and he'd rather do this thing properly or not do it at all. He stood there a moment with his hand on the animal's flank, doing the math anyway, because a rancher's mind did that math whether he wanted it to or not. Weeks of feed, a season's worth of careful breeding, money he didn't have extra of. Not this year, not with the well needing work and the roof still patched instead of properly fixed. Ruth would have done it faster than him, he thought, wouldn't have stood here weighing it at all. He remembered a winter years back, when a family passing through white settlers, a wagon with a broken axle, and 3 children too thin for the season, had stopped at the ranch asking only for directions to the next town. Ruth hadn't given them directions. She'd given them a week's worth of supplies and half a day fixing that axle herself, hands black with grease, laughing the whole time like it was the best afternoon she'd had in months. He'd asked her once why she did things like that, why she gave so freely to people who'd likely never cross her path again. "Because it isn't about seeing them again," she'd told him. "It's about who I want to be able to look at in the mirror come morning." He hadn't fully understood it then. Understood it better now, standing here with his hand on an animal that represented weeks of careful work, about to give it away to 4 strangers he'd known less than an hour. He drew the knife, didn't hesitate again. The work that followed was hard, familiar, the kind of labor his hands knew without his mind needing to direct them. He worked quickly, efficiently, and didn't let himself think too long about the weeks of income walking away from him with every cut, because thinking too long about it was how a man talked himself out of doing the right thing. By the time he had the meat ready, the fire built up outside near the cottonwood shade, the afternoon had softened into that particular gold that only happens in the hour or two before evening properly arrives. He worked the fire, set the meat to cook, pulled out flour and started bread, his hands moving through motions Ruth had once done in this same kitchen, motions he'd learned by necessity after she was gone and had never quite stopped resenting until this exact moment when the necessity finally felt like it meant something again. Beans went into the pot beside the meat. Simple food, honest food. The smell drifted out across the yard, and he saw the effect it had on the 4 people resting beneath the cottonwoods, the way Atua's head lifted first, the way Sela's hand found Toya's again. Not for support this time, but something closer to relief. Sela rose after a while, crossed the yard slowly, favoring one hip, stood near the fire, watching Caleb work the bread dough with the careful, uncertain hands of a man who had learned this skill out of grief rather than love. "You do this alone," she said. Not quite a question. "Long time now," Caleb said. "Wife passed." 5 years, Sela nodded, like the number confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Bread is not easy alone." "No," Caleb agreed. "It isn't." She reached out without asking and adjusted the shape of the dough beneath his hands, a small correction, the kind one cook offers another without needing permission first. Caleb let her, watched the shape improve under her touch. "Better," she said. "Better," he agreed. It was the first time all day something had passed easily between them. No fear behind it, no careful measuring of danger. Just 2 people who understood the same simple thing, that bread, done right, took patience, and patience was a language that didn't need much translating. While the meal cooked, Caleb found himself doing something he hadn't expected. Watching them. Not with suspicion anymore, that particular tension had drained out of him, somewhere between the well and the fire, but with something closer to curiosity. Toya sat with his back against a cottonwood trunk, eyes half closed, though Caleb doubted the man was actually resting. There was a watchfulness to him, even now, even exhausted, the careful alertness of someone who had learned not to fully lower his guard even in a place that seemed, for the moment, safe. Sela sat close beside him, her weathered hands working at something small, mending a torn piece of clothing, Caleb realized. Using a bone needle and a length of sinew thread she must have carried through everything that had happened to them. The steadiness of it struck him. In the middle of losing everything, she still found her hands wanting useful work. Ituha sat a little apart, tending to Chodi's comfort in small, quiet ways, adjusting the sling Caleb had rigged from a spare shirt, murmuring something low when the young man shifted and winced. There was a fierceness in her that Caleb recognized from somewhere deep in his own memory, though it took him a moment to place it. It was the same look Ruth used to get, tending to sick calves through a long winter night. The look of someone who had decided somewhere along the way that certain things were worth protecting no matter the cost to themselves. He mentioned it to Sela later, while she helped him carry water back toward the fire. Asked, carefully, whether Ituha and Chodi were married. He hadn't meant it as anything beyond simple curiosity. But the moment the words left him, he felt the wrongness of them, the way a man feels misstitched before his foot has even finished landing. Sela's face changed just slightly. No, she said. Brother and sister of the heart, not of blood. I didn't mean her husband, Sela said, quiet, was one who did not run fast enough. Caleb went still. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it more than the two small words could carry. Sela nodded once, accepting the apology the way she seemed to accept most things, without excess, without drama, simply folding it into the weight she was already carrying. She does not speak of it, but she does not need to. You can see it in how she watches Chodi, like she has already decided not to lose another person she loves, whether or not it is hers to decide. Caleb thought of Atuha's grip on Chodi's arm back at the fence line, understood it differently now. Not simply kindness, something closer to a vow. He didn't ask anything else. Some grief didn't need more questions asked of it. It needed only to be seen and left alone, and carried by the person who owned it in whatever way they'd chosen to carry it. Later, near the fire, he caught Chodi watching him with an expression that wasn't quite suspicion anymore, though it wasn't full trust either. Somewhere between the two. The look of a young man raised to be a warrior, forced instead into the position of someone who had to be carried, and hating the position more than he'd ever admit out loud. You were a soldier, Chodi said. Not really a question. Long time ago. You fought. I scouted mostly. Watched. Chodi considered that. That is not nothing, no. Caleb agreed, it isn't. But it isn't the same as what you do either. Something in the young man's shoulders eased, just slightly, at that the small relief of not being mistaken for something he wasn't, of having the distinction actually noticed and respected instead of flattened down into one easy word. When this heals, Chodi said, glancing at the sling, I will not need carrying again. Didn't figure you would, Caleb said. Chodi almost smiled at that. Almost. Caleb turned back to the fire before the thought could take him somewhere he wasn't ready to go. They looked nothing like the stories. That was the thought that kept returning to him, circling back no matter how many times he tried to set it aside. Nothing like the raiding parties Walter described with such certainty. Nothing like the shadowy threat that filled saloon conversation and mercantile gossip in equal measure. They looked like people. Tired people. Grieving people. People who had lost something enormous and were still, somehow, moving forward through the wreckage of it because moving forward was the only option left to them. The same, he thought, as the settlers who came through this country every year, with wagons full of everything they owned, and nothing certain waiting at the other end. The same hunger, exhaustion, the same stubborn refusal to stop simply because stopping felt, some days, like the easier choice. The desert didn't care about the difference between them. Never had. It burned the same sun on every traveler who crossed it, indifferent to whatever story they carried, whatever side of whatever conflict they'd been born into. Maybe that was the only honest thing left in this whole territory. The desert's indifference. Everything else, the fear, the suspicion, the careful lines men drew between themselves, and people they'd never actually taken the time to meet, all of that was human invention, dressed up as necessity. Caleb stirred the beans, turned the meat, and felt something in his chest settle that had been unsettled for longer than this single afternoon. When the food was ready, he served generous portions onto the metal plates he kept for ranch hands during branding season, back when he'd still hired help, back before the ranch had shrunk down to just him and silence. He carried the plates out himself. The Apache family accepted them with the same careful dignity they'd shown with the water. Ituha made certain Chode ate before she touched her own plate, guiding food toward his good hand with quiet efficiency. Sela did something similar with Toya, though the old man protested it lightly, a brief exchange in their own language that carried the unmistakable rhythm of an old married joke neither of them needed translated. Caleb sat several feet away, ate from his own plate, kept the respectful distance he sensed the moment required, though something in him wanted to close it, wanted to sit closer, wanted to understand more of what these strangers had lived through. He didn't. Some things he understood weren't his to ask for. Not yet. Maybe not ever. No one spoke much. The silence around the fire had a different quality than the silence in his cabin every morning. That silence was empty. This one was full of things too large for words, full of a peace that didn't need conversation to sustain it. The sun slipped lower, painted the mountains in shades of red and gold that no artist had ever quite managed to capture honestly. Caleb watched the light change and thought, not for the first time that day, that he had made a choice most of the men he knew would not have understood. Walter wouldn't understand it. The men in town wouldn't understand it. Even Ruth, gentle as she'd been, might have hesitated at the sight of 4 strangers walking up out of the desert with nothing but empty water skins and a story about fighting. But sitting here now, watching Chode's shoulders finally ease, watching Sela's hands go still in her lap for the first time since they'd arrived, Caleb felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Certainty. Quiet, complete. The kind that didn't need anyone else's agreement to hold steady. Toward the end of the meal, Caleb asked, carefully, about the fighting Toya had mentioned earlier. Not pressing, just leaving the door open, in case the old man wanted to walk through it. Toya considered the question a long moment before answering. There has been trouble along the river for 2 summers now, he said. Soldiers. Settlers wanting the water. Our people, wanting only to stay where our fathers are buried. He turned his tin cup slowly in his hands, watching the last of the firelight catch on it. Some of my people have answered trouble with trouble. I will not pretend otherwise. War does not stay only on one side of anything, once it has begun. No, Caleb said. It doesn't, but this. Toya gestured briefly toward Chode's sling, toward the exhaustion still sitting heavy on all 4 of them. This was not soldiers. Was not the fighting we know how to expect even when we do not want it. This was something else, how do you mean? Soldiers come with orders, Toya said. Even cruel ones. Even ones we do not forgive. There is still a reason behind it, however poor a reason it is. What came for us 3 nights ago came with no orders at all. Only wanting. Caleb turned that over in his mind, the fire popping softly between them, and felt the same cold thread from earlier tighten another notch. Wanting what, he said. Toya's eyes met his, steady, unflinching. Everything, he said. That is the difference, I think, between a war and men who have simply decided the rules no longer apply to them. Caleb didn't have an answer for that. Wasn't sure there was one worth offering. As the meal wound down and the fire settled into its low evening crackle, Toya spoke again, slower this time, less guarded, the words coming easier now that his body had some strength back in it. You did not have to do this, he said. No, Caleb agreed. Didn't have to. Others would not have. Maybe not. Toya studied him across the firelight. There was something searching in the look, something Caleb couldn't quite read. Why, it wasn't much of a question stripped down to that single word. But it carried the whole weight of everything unsaid between them, every warning Caleb had ignored, every risk he'd taken on with no promise of anything in return. Caleb thought about it a long moment before answering. Thought about the war. About Ruth. About every version of this exact moment he'd witnessed from the wrong side, watching fear win out over decency in men he'd once respected. Because hunger doesn't care what a man looks like, he said finally, and I've seen enough of it to know that. Toya nodded slowly. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but close to one, the ghost of an expression that suggested the answer had landed somewhere true. Then we are grateful, he said, more than words can carry. You don't owe me anything, Caleb said, and meant it. Perhaps not, Toya said, but debts are not always about owing. Caleb didn't fully understand what he meant by that. Not then. Wouldn't understand it, in fact, for weeks yet, until a night arrived that would put the old man's words into a context. Caleb couldn't have imagined sitting here in this gentle golden evening. For now, he only nodded. Let the moment be what it was, uncomplicated by whatever the future might eventually make of it. They stayed until the light had nearly gone, resting in the shade that had turned to shadow, gathering back some of the strength the day's kindness had given them. When Toya finally rose, the others rose with him, quiet and unhurried, the way people move when they've relearned, in the space of a single afternoon, that the world could still hold room for gentleness. "We go north," Toya said. "You're welcome to stay the night," Caleb offered. "Barns dry. Better than open ground." Toya considered it, shook his head gently. "We have far still to go," he said, "and it is better, I think, that we are not found here, for your sake as much as ours." Caleb understood the wisdom in that, even as some part of him wished otherwise. He walked out with them to gather what little he could spare for the road: a second water skin, a small sack of flour, a strip of dried meat wrapped in cloth. Practical things. The kind of gift that didn't ask to be remembered, only to be useful. Sela took the flour from his hands and held his gaze a moment longer than the exchange required. "You have a good hand for bread," she said, "for a man alone. Had a teacher once. She would be proud, I think, of this day." Caleb didn't trust his voice enough to answer that directly. He only nodded and let the silence carry what he couldn't. Chody came next, moving stiffly, the sling holding his arm close. Didn't offer his hand. The gesture wasn't his to offer yet. Not with the injury, but he inclined his head, slow and deliberate. The kind of respect one fighting man pays another, regardless of which side of a line they'd been born on. "I will not forget this," he said. "Don't need you to," Caleb said. "Just get that shoulder healed." Something almost like a laugh moved through the young man, quickly swallowed. "You sound like my uncle. Man's probably right more often than you'd like." Last was Ituha. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him a long moment, the same fierce, measuring look he'd noticed all afternoon, softened now at the edges into something closer to gratitude. "You saw him," she said finally. Meaning Chody. Meaning Caleb understood. Something larger than just the wound. Really saw him, not just, she searched for the word, careful with her English, not just a shape to be afraid of. "Wasn't hard," Caleb said, "once I actually looked." "That is rarer than you think," she said, "out here." She didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. She simply held his gaze a moment longer, then turned to help Sela settle the flour sack properly across her shoulder. And the moment passed the way certain moments do not forgotten, only folded quietly into everything that had come before it. He walked with them as far as the edge of his property, the sky behind the mountains deepening into that particular shade of purple that comes just before true dark. At the fence line, Toya stopped, turned back toward him. He placed one hand flat over his heart, then extended it, palm up, toward the distant mountains, where the last of the light was disappearing. "People remember bullets," Toya said quietly, his English slow and deliberate, as though he had turned the words over a long time before finding the courage to say them to a stranger. "But this, what you gave today, this too, will be remembered. In its own way." Words weren't necessary for what the gesture meant. Caleb understood it anyway, the way certain things cross between people without needing translation at all. Kindness would not be forgotten. "Go safe," Caleb said. "And you," Toya answered, "whatever comes." There was something in the way he said it, a weight underneath the simple words that Caleb would only understand much later, turning it over and over in his memory once the meaning had become impossible to miss. For now he only watched them go. 4 figures growing smaller against the darkening land, moving north with the careful, deliberate pace of people who had learned not to waste a single ounce of strength they didn't have to spare. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the folds of the hills, swallowed by shadow and distance, leaving behind nothing but footprints already fading in the loose dirt, and a silence that felt, for the first time in longer than Caleb could remember, different from the silence he was used to. Not empty, just quiet. He walked back to the house in the last of the light, closed up the barn, checked the horses one final time, the way he did every night, though tonight the ritual felt like it belonged to some other version of the day, the version before 4 strangers had walked up out of the shimmering heat and changed something in him he didn't yet have words for. Inside the cabin was dark and still, the fire long since burned down to embers. He didn't light a lamp right away. Just stood a moment in the doorway, looking at the space Ruth used to fill, feeling the particular ache that came with certain kinds of quiet. Except tonight the ache felt different, lighter, somehow, as though the act of feeding 4 hungry strangers had loosened something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 5 long years. He thought about Toya's parting words, the strange weight they'd carried. He thought about the wound on Chody's shoulder, the particular unsettling shape of it, the memory it had stirred of a weapon he hadn't thought about in years, carried by men he'd once served beside and never trusted. He thought about villages burned in the night. About fighting that wasn't the fighting Walter Pruitt meant when he used that word so easily, so certainly, as though the story only ever ran one direction. Something uneasy stirred beneath the quiet satisfaction of the day. A small cold thread of worry he couldn't yet name, couldn't yet trace back to its source, but which sat in his chest all the same, refusing to fully settle, no matter how many times he'd told himself the day was simply done. He thought about what Walter would say, if he ever found out. Walter didn't have that in him. Not really. Not underneath the warnings and the worry. He'd just look at Caleb with that particular weariness, the look of a man watching a friend walk toward a cliff he couldn't see. And he'd say something like, "I told you," or something worse. Something quieter, "Didn't figure you for a fool, Caleb." Except Caleb didn't feel like a fool. That was the strange part. Sitting here now, running the whole day back through his mind, he couldn't find the foolishness in any of it, only the opposite. A rightness so plain it almost embarrassed him, the way simple truths sometimes do when a man spent years overcomplicating them out of fear. He lit the lamp at last, sat at the table, poured himself a small measure of whiskey he rarely touched, and looked for a long while at nothing in particular. His mind kept circling back to the weapon, to the particular tear in Chody's shoulder, the shape of it, the memory it had dragged up out of a decade he'd worked hard to leave behind him. He told himself again that it meant nothing. Coincidence. A common enough type of cruelty, dressed up to look like something more specific than it was. He almost believed himself. Almost. But some old instinct, the same one that had kept him alive through 3 years of scouting, the same one that had gone quiet after Ruth died, and was only now, apparently, waking back up, refused to let the thought settle all the way down. It sat there instead, low and persistent, the way a splinter sits under skin long after the wound around it has closed. Because something had shifted today. He could feel it, the way a man feels weather changing before the clouds have even gathered, a pressure in the air, a stillness that wasn't quite stillness at all, but the held breath before something larger arrived. He didn't know yet what that something would be, didn't know that the choice he'd made this afternoon, feeding 4 hungry strangers against every warning his neighbors had ever given him, had already set something in motion that would return to this very ranch, weeks from now, in a form he could not begin to imagine tonight. For now he only sat in the lamplight, alone with his whiskey and his thoughts, while outside the desert cooled beneath a sky full of more stars than any man could ever properly count. He went to bed eventually, lay staring at the same 11 boards he counted every morning, except tonight counting them brought no comfort at all. Sleep didn't come easy. He kept seeing the wound, kept seeing the particular tear of it, the shape his mind refused to stop turning over, no matter how many times he told himself he was building a fear out of nothing. Kept hearing Toya's voice, no name, only laughter, and the guns circling back around every time he came close to drifting off. Somewhere past midnight, a coyote called out on the ridge, and something in him went taut, listening, the old scout's instinct, rising up out of 5 years of quiet like it had never actually left at all. He waited. Nothing followed. Just the wind and the horses shifting in the barn, and his own heartbeat slowing back down by degrees. He told himself it was nothing. Told himself again because the first time hadn't taken, and somewhere out there, moving steadily north through darkness, 4 people carried with them, not just the food and water he had given freely, but something else. Something that would not be forgotten. Something that in time would find its way back to him. Though tonight, Caleb Whitfield knew none of that. Tonight he only knew that he had done what felt right, and that for the first time in longer than he could remember, the silence in his house had felt less like an absence, and more like a beginning. 3 weeks. That was how long it took for the quiet to feel normal again. 3 weeks of fences and cattle and mornings that started the same 11 boards above his head. 3 weeks of almost forgetting the taste of that particular evening, the fire, the bread, the old man's hand pressed flat against his heart. Almost. Because it never fully left him. Not the memory. Not the small cold thread that had settled into his chest that first night, and simply stayed there, quiet, patient, waiting for a reason to pull tight again. Summer had arrived in earnest now. The land had gone from merely hot to something closer to punishing, heat rising in visible sheets off the flats, the creek running thinner every week. Caleb checked it. He kept working anyway. Kept his hands busy. The way a man does when he's learned that busy hands are the only thing standing between him and thoughts he'd rather not sit with too long. He never told anyone what he'd done that afternoon. Not Walter. Not the men at the feed store. Some things, he'd decided, didn't need an audience to be true. Kindness given for the sake of being seen wasn't really kindness at all. It was performance wearing kindness like a borrowed coat. So, he carried it alone, except some sheiks. Mendings in the long gold light. Before dark, he caught himself glancing toward the western ridge without meaning to. Half expecting, some foolish part of him hoped to see 4 familiar shapes crossing the shimmer again. They never did. Of course they never did. People like that didn't retrace their steps once the road had carried them on. Still he looked, most evenings. He found himself doing other things too, small things he couldn't quite explain even to himself. Leaving a little extra water drawn each morning, more than the horses needed. Baking bread even on days he didn't especially want it, just for the plain comfort of doing something with his hands that once Sleek had one created with 2 fingers and no wasted words. Better, she'd said. He heard it sometimes, doing the work. Better. He didn't tell anyone about any of that either. Some things a man kept simply because they were his, and because naming them out loud tended to wear the shine off things that needed to stay private to stay whole. Until the day the quiet finally broke. He rode into Dry Wells for supplies on a Tuesday that felt at first like every other supply run he'd made that summer. Flour, coffee, a new hinge for the gate he still hadn't properly fixed. Ordinary errands, ordinary heat, ordinary dust kicked up by the wagon wheels on the road into town. The town itself told a different story. He felt it before he understood it. A tightness in the air outside the mercantile. Men standing in clusters instead of walking their business. Voices pitched low and urgent in a way that never meant good news. He tied his horse and went in anyway, because it didn't buy itself, and because whatever this was, avoiding it wouldn't make it less true. You hear? The storekeeper asked before Caleb had even set his list on the counter. Hear what? Larkin Ranch, 2 nights back. The man's hands didn't stop moving as he talked, weighing flour, tying off the sack, but his eyes kept drifting toward the door, like he expected trouble to walk through it any minute. Whole herd gone. Barn burned to the ground. Larkin's boy took a bullet in the leg trying to stop it. Apache? Caleb asked. Careful. Testing the word the way he tested everything now. No, the storekeeper's voice dropped lower. White men. A gang. 15, 20 of them, riding together like an army. Man leading it goes by Boyle, Emmett Boyle. Something in Caleb went very still. The name landed in him wrong. Familiar in a way that had no business being familiar, given he'd never heard it spoken in this town before. Except that wasn't quite true either, except he had heard it. Once. A long time ago. In a place he'd worked hard not to think about. You know him? The storekeeper asked, catching something in Caleb's face he hadn't meant to show. No, Caleb said. Too quick. Behind him, near the dry goods shelf, a woman he half recognized from church gatherings was talking to another, voice pitched to carry further than she probably intended. They're saying it might be Apache after all, she said. Working with the gang, maybe. Or blamed for it regardless, once folks get frightened enough not to care about the difference. That's not what the sheriff said, the other woman answered uncertain. Sheriff wants man. Fear's got a mind of its own. Caleb felt something twist in his chest, hearing it. Not surprise, exactly. He'd known this was coming, the moment the storekeeper said white men. The way he'd known certain kinds of weather were coming, the moment the sky took on a particular color. Fear didn't need facts to spread. It only needed a direction to travel, and people frightened enough to stop asking whether the direction made any sense. He thought of Toya, of Sella's careful hands mending torn cloth by a cottonwood fire, of how easily this town might fold them into a story that had nothing to do with who they actually were, simply because it was easier to have one enemy than to untangle 2 separate kinds of danger moving through the same stretch of desert. Outside the mercantile, he saw exactly how easily. An old Apache man stood near the water trough, alone, clearly just passing through on some errand of his own, filling a water skin with the careful economy of someone accustomed to being watched with suspicion wherever he went. 2 men from town had stopped near him, not quite blocking his path, not quite doing anything a sheriff could rightly call trouble. Just standing close. Just watching. Just letting their presence say what their words hadn't yet. Long way from wherever you belong, one of them said. Not loud. Just loud enough. The old man didn't answer, didn't look up from the trough. Caleb felt something tighten in his jaw, an old instinct rising that had nothing to do with Boyle or Toy or anything specific at all, just the plain, uncomplicated wrongness of watching someone corner a man for no better reason than his own fear needing a target. He crossed the street before he'd fully decided to. "Help you boys with something?" he said, mild, though there was nothing mild underneath it. The 2 young men looked over, sizing him up, and whatever they saw in his face made them reconsider whatever they'd been building toward. "No trouble here, Whitfield," one of them said, already stepping back. "Just talking." "Looked like talking," Caleb said. Didn't sound much like it. They moved off without further argument, the particular cowardice of men who only found their courage in numbers and easy targets. The old man finished filling his water skin, unhurried, and gave Caleb a small nod before moving on his way. Not quite gratitude. Not quite anything Caleb felt he'd earned, just acknowledgement. One man to another, across whatever distance the world insisted on keeping between them. Caleb watched him go and thought, not for the first time, that fear made cowards of people who might otherwise have been decent enough, given half a reason to be. He paid for the flour, left before the conversation inside could go anywhere further, because his hands had started doing that thing they only did when the ground underneath him had shifted. Without warning, a faint involuntary tremor he hadn't felt since the war, since the last time a name had arrived carrying more weight than a man was prepared to hold. Outside, Sheriff Boone found him loading the wagon. "Heard you got the news," Boone said. "Heard some of it. There's more coming probably, before this is done. Gang's been working its way north for near a month now. Larkin's the fourth place hit." Boone's face had that permanent tiredness to it, the look of a man carrying responsibility for more territory than Badge could reasonably manage. "Your place is out that direction. Thought you should know. Appreciate it. You got a way to defend it, if it comes to that?" "Same way I always have." Boone studied him a moment. "That's not really an answer, Caleb. It's the only one I've got right now." He almost said more. Almost told Boone the rest of it, the name that had landed wrong in his chest back at the Mercantile, the decade-old column, the reason this particular gang might ride harder toward his gate than any other ranchers in the territory. Didn't. Because saying it out loud made it real in a way it wasn't quite real yet. Because some part of him still wanted to believe he was wrong about the name, wrong about the coincidence, wrong about all of it, right up until the moment he no longer had the luxury of being wrong. And because Boone had enough weight on him already without Caleb adding a decade-old war grudge to the pile. "There's more to it," Caleb said instead. "Careful. Might tell you the whole of it sometime. Not to—" Boone's eyes narrowed slightly, reading something in the hesitation, but he didn't press. "Whenever you're ready. My door's open." Boone nodded slowly, like he understood the limits of what either of them could do about any of it. "I'll send word if I hear anything more specific. Can't promise more than that. Not with the men I've got. Didn't expect you could." He loaded the last of the flour and turned the wagon for home. On the road out of town, he passed the Larkin place itself, close enough to see it from the trail. What was left of the barn stood like a blackened ribcage against the sky, still smoking faintly 2 days on. A boy sat on the porch steps with his leg bandaged and propped up, staring at nothing in particular, the way people stare when their mind hasn't caught up yet to what their eyes have already seen. Caleb didn't stop. Didn't know the family well enough to intrude on grief that wasn't his to share. But he slowed the wagon a moment, hat in hand, and the boy looked up just long enough to meet his eyes. Neither of them said anything. Didn't need to. Caleb rode home with the image of that burned barn, and the name Boyle sitting heavier in his chest with every mile. Emmett Boyle. He turned it over and over, trying to convince himself it was coincidence, a common enough name, nothing more than that. He didn't fully believe himself. Hadn't, if he was honest, since the moment the storekeeper first said it out loud. That night, unable to settle, he did something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He opened the trunk at the foot of the bed. Ruth's trunk, full of things he'd never had the heart to sort through properly: letters, a folded quilt, a small wooden box of buttons and thread she'd kept for mending. He was looking for nothing in particular, just needed his hands busy with something that wasn't fear. His fingers found a bundle of letters near the bottom, tied with faded ribbon. Not letters to him. Letters she'd written and never sent, the way some women did, working out on paper what they couldn't quite say out loud. He shouldn't read them. He knew that even as he untied the ribbon, read them anyway. Most were small things. Thoughts about the garden. A worry about a bad winter. A line about missing her sister back east. Another about a recipe she meant to try and never got around to. He read each one slowly, the way a man reads something he knows he'll never get to read again once he reaches the last page, rationing them out despite himself. Then, near the bottom of the stack, one that stopped him cold, she'd written about a family. Apache passing through during a hard winter 3 years before she got sick, the year Caleb had been away at the far pasture for nearly a week, tending a sick herd. She'd fed them, given them blankets, never told him. "I did not tell Caleb," she'd written, "because I was not sure he would understand, and I did not want to find out he wouldn't. But I could not turn away hungry people from our door and call myself decent afterward. I think, if he ever learns of it, He will understand better than I gave him credit for. I hope so. I married a better man than most give him credit for being. There was more, further down, in handwriting slightly less steady than the rest. I think sometimes decency is a quiet thing. Nobody writes songs about a woman handing over a blanket in the cold. But I would rather be the kind of person who does small right things nobody sees, than the kind who waits for an audience before deciding to be good at all. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. Because she'd never told him. Because she'd carried that same fear he'd carried 3 weeks back, the fear of being misunderstood for doing the right thing, and carried it alone, the way he'd carried his own secret alone, never once imagining they'd been walking the same quiet path years apart from each other. And because now, sitting here with her handwriting in front of him, what he'd done at his own gate that afternoon, didn't feel like a choice he'd made alone anymore. It felt like something she'd started, something he'd simply finished. He pressed the letter flat against his knee, looked for a long moment at nothing at all, while 5 years of grief folded quietly into something new, not exactly, but less lonely. As though she'd left a door open somewhere he hadn't known to look for, and he'd only just now, by accident, walked through it. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in his shirt pocket close to his chest, and didn't take it out again for a long while after. He was still turning it over 3 days later when he heard riders approaching. Not one, several. He set down the axe he'd been splitting wood with and reached for the rifle propped against the woodpile, old instinct moving faster than conscious thought. Dust rose first, a thin brown column against the pale afternoon sky, visible above the ridge before the riders themselves came into view. The kind of dust that meant more than one horse walking easy. The kind that meant men who didn't much care whether anyone saw them coming. 4 men came around the bend in the trail, rough-looking, unhurried, the particular confidence of men who had never once had to wonder whether they were welcome somewhere. The one in front reined up at the fence line, didn't dismount, just sat there studying Caleb with an expression that started as mild curiosity and shifted slowly into something else entirely. Something that looked unmistakably like recognition. "Well," the man said, "I'll be damned." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. No, couldn't be that voice. Unmistakable, dropping into his chest like a stone into still water. Except 10 years worse was a long time, except men changed out here, hardened or broke or both, and maybe he was wrong. Maybe he wasn't wrong. "Whitfield," the man said. "Caleb Whitfield. Didn't figure I'd ever see that face again. Not out here. Not anywhere, honestly, given how things ended between us." Caleb's chest went tight because he knew the voice before he fully placed the face. Knew it from a decade back, from a supply column, from an argument around a fire about what to do with men who'd already surrendered. Knew it from the exact moment he'd watched this same man raise a pistol to a prisoner's head with his hands still bound and pull the trigger before anyone could stop him. "Boyle," Caleb said. "Quiet. There he is." Emmett Boyle smiled, and there was nothing warm in it at all. "Knew you'd remember eventually." Was starting to wonder. "You've got no business here," Caleb said. "Everybody's got business everywhere these days." Boyle swung down from his horse, slow, deliberate, the 3 men behind him staying mounted, watching. "Nice spread you've built. Heard you were out this way. Didn't believe it till just now. Say what you came to say." Direct, always were. Boyle walked closer to the fence, resting a forearm on the top rail like they were 2 old friends catching up. "You remember that column? Outside that town whose name neither of us ever bothered learning properly." "I remember." "You remember what you did afterward?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "I remember what you did. Reported it. Same as anyone with a conscience would have reported it." Boyle's voice had an edge to it now, thin and cold underneath the easy smile. "Got me stripped of rank. Court-martialed. Sent home in disgrace to a family that wanted nothing to do with the disgraced man. You ever wonder what happened to me after that, Whitfield? After your conscience did its work?" "Can't say I did, no." Boyle's smile thinned further. "Don't imagine you did. Men like you rarely wonder what happens to men like me. You get to walk away clean. Build yourself a ranch, marry yourself a wife." Something flickered behind his eyes. "Heard about that too. Heard she passed." "Don't," Caleb said. Low. Warning. Touched a nerve. Boyle didn't look sorry about it. "Good. Means you're still in there somewhere." "Man who reported me for showing prisoners exactly the mercy this territory shows anybody who can't defend themselves. That wasn't mercy. What you did to those men. It was honesty," Boyle said. "Only kind this world respects in the end. You taught me that, in a roundabout way. Taught me nobody protects you out here except yourself. So I stopped waiting on anyone else to do it. You could have been a different man after that, Caleb said. Instead of this. Could have. Boyle's expression didn't change, though something underneath it seemed to shift, some old wound Caleb had accidentally pressed. Tried, actually. For a while. Went home. Tried to be the man my family wanted back. Turns out disgrace follows a name real close once it's attacked. Nobody wants to hire a court-martialed man. Nobody wants to lend him money, marry his sister, sit next to him in church. You reported honesty, Whitfield. World punished me for it anyway. That's not on me, isn't it, though? Every choice has a cost. Yours cost me everything I had. Seems only fair mine cost you something too. This isn't fair. This is revenge dressed up as philosophy. Something flickered across Boyle's face, the barest flash of something almost like agreement, gone as quickly as it appeared. Maybe, he said. Doesn't make it any less true. You've been hitting ranches up and down this territory, Caleb said. Larkin's place. Others before it. Word travels that all you've been hitting. Something shifted in Boyle's face. Amusement, maybe. Or something closer to pride, the kind that didn't care whether it should be ashamed of itself. There was a village a few weeks back, off toward the river. Nothing worth mentioning to men like Boone. Just some Apache who had the poor luck of sitting on ground I wanted cleared. He shrugged, easy, like the memory cost him nothing at all. Burned it. Scattered whoever ran fast enough to matter. Funny thing about that, though. Caleb's jaw tightened. What's funny about it? Heard some of the ones who got away came through this direction. Hungry. Desperate. Boyle's eyes narrowed slightly, reading something in Caleb's stillness that he clearly enjoyed finding. Heard a rancher out this way took a shine to feeding travelers who wandered up to his door. Funny, the shape the world takes sometimes. Small territory, this. Smaller than it looks on a map. Caleb said nothing. Didn't trust himself to. Doesn't have to end that way, he managed finally. Whatever this is between us, oh, it ends exactly how it's going to end, Boyle said, and something in his voice had gone flat now, final. I've thought about this moment a fair amount, Whitfield. Wondered what I'd say if I ever crossed your path again. Turns out there's not much to say at all. Just this. He nodded, almost pleasant, toward the ranch behind Caleb. Nice spread. Be ashamed to see something happen to it. That a threat. That's a fact. I don't waste breath on threats. Never have. Caleb's eyes dropped, almost without meaning, to the rifle holstered along Boyle's saddle. Custom stock. Heavier barrel than standard issue. The exact kind of weapon a certain type of man had once collected during the war, prizing the extra damage it did. The same shape of wound he'd bandaged 3 weeks back, on a young man's shoulder beneath a cottonwood tree. Something in his stomach dropped straight through the floor. Because it wasn't a coincidence after all. Hadn't been, probably, from the very first moment he'd looked at that wound and felt something cold move through him. He just hadn't wanted it to be true badly enough to keep looking away from it. He remounted, unhurried, the 3 men behind him watching Caleb with the flat, assessing expressions of men, deciding how much trouble he'd likely be. Give my regards to the neighbors, Boyle said. Heard you're the neighborly type these days. Heard you fed some travelers a few weeks back. Word travels that way too, you know. Travels real easy. Out here, Caleb's blood went cold. Boyle only smiled wider at whatever he saw cross Caleb's face. Turned his horse. Rode off unhurried, the way a man rides when he's already certain how the ending goes, and doesn't feel any particular need to rush toward it. Caleb stood at the fence a long time after the dust had settled, rifle still in his hands, heart hammering in a way it hadn't hammered since the war. He rode to Dry Wells again the next morning, faster than the trip required, and found Boone at his desk sorting through papers with the particular weariness of a man already stretched too thin. Boyle came to my place, Caleb said, no preamble. Boone looked up sharp. When yesterday. 4 men, said his piece and rode off. He threatened you? Didn't have to, just reminded me he knew where I lived. Caleb set both hands flat on the desk. I need to know what you can do, Boone. Straight answer. Boone leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. Straight answer is I've got 3 deputies covering more ground than any 6 men could reasonably watch. Boyle's got near 20 riders, from what I hear, moving fast and hitting wherever he pleases. I can send a man out your way when I've got one to spare. Can't promise you when that'll be. That's not much of an answer. It's the honest one, Boone said. I wish I had a better. Caleb rode home with that honesty sitting heavier in his chest than any lie would have. Alone. That was the shape of it, stripped down to its plainest truth. Whatever came for his ranch would arrive before help did, if help arrived at all. But it wasn't only his own danger sitting heaviest on him that afternoon. He thought of Boyle's words. Heard some of the ones who got away came through this direction. If Boyle knew that much, knew enough to throw it at Caleb like a blade meant to cut, then it wasn't impossible he knew which direction they'd gone afterward. Wasn't impossible he'd go looking for what he considered unfinished business. Caleb couldn't sit with that thought for long before he was saddling his horse again, riding north along the same ridge Toya's family had disappeared behind weeks before. Foolish, probably. He had no way of knowing where they'd settled, if they'd settled anywhere at all. No way of covering enough ground before dark to make any real difference. Went anyway. He followed what he could of the old trail faint signs, mostly gone now, worn away by weeks of wind and one hard rain. A broken twig here. A half print in softer ground there, already crumbling at the edges. He rode until the light started failing, until the mountains ahead turned the deep bruised purple that meant he'd need every remaining minute just to get himself home safely. He found nothing. No fire pit, no sign of a camp, recent or otherwise. Just empty land, indifferent and enormous, swallowing every trace of the people he was searching for, the same way it swallowed everything else out here eventually. He sat his horse a long moment at the top of the ridge, looking north into country he couldn't safely enter any further, and felt something helpless settle into his chest alongside the fear. "I hope you're further than this," he said, out loud, to no one. "I hope you're somewhere he can't reach." The wind didn't answer him. Didn't need to. He turned his horse back toward home, the failing light chasing him the whole way, and rode with the particular ache of a man who had done everything he could think to do, and knew it likely wasn't enough. So he started preparing the only way he knew how. Once he was home again, the ranch dark and waiting around him, he spent the afternoon reinforcing the barn doors, running fresh wire along the weakest stretch of fence, counting his ammunition twice and coming up short both times. He walked the property the way he used to walk unfamiliar ground during the war, cataloging sight lines, cover, the places a man could hide and the places he couldn't. Old instincts waking up fast now, faster than he liked. That night he checked every lock on the barn twice, moved the cattle into the strongest enclosure he had, sat up later than he should have, lamp burning low, mind circling the same track over and over, because Boyle knew about the Apache family, which meant someone had talked, or Boyle's men had eyes further out than Caleb had ever imagined. Either way, it meant the danger wasn't only to himself anymore. He must have drifted at some point, because the war found him the way it always eventually did when his guard finally dropped. Not the whole of it, just fragments. The supply column, rising somewhere off past a tree line. A young lieutenant's voice, steady even as the shouting rose around him. "That isn't soldiering. That's just murder wearing a uniform." And then, underneath all of it, a single gunshot that had nothing to do with any battle, echoing louder in memory than it ever had in fact. He woke with his hand already reaching for the rifle beside the bed, heart slamming, the 11 boards above him swimming back into focus one at a time. Just a dream, he told himself. Except it wasn't only a dream. It was a memory wearing a dream's clothing, the way memories sometimes did when a man's mind needed to relive something in order to finally understand what it meant. He sat up, lit the lamp, didn't bother trying to sleep again, until he heard the soft knock at his door well past midnight and nearly put a bullet through it before recognizing the voice on the other side. "Caleb, it's Walter." He opened the door to find Walter Pruitt standing there, hat in hand, looking like a man who hadn't slept in 2 nights. "It's late, Walter." "I know it." Walter stepped inside without waiting to be asked, which wasn't like him at all. Wouldn't have come if it could wait. "What is it?" Walter's hands turned his hat over once, as before he finally looked up. "Boyle's been in town. Recruiting. Buying drinks, buying loyalty, buying silence from anybody who'll take his money. Man's putting together something bigger than what he's already got." "How do you know all this?" "Because my nephew tends bar at the saloon," Walter said. "Overheard 2 of Boyle's men talking careless, the way men do after their 3rd whiskey. They named your place, Caleb. Said it plain enough. My nephew rode straight out to my ranch. Soon as his shift ended, scared half to death." "What exactly did they say?" Walter's jaw worked a moment before the words came. "Said Boyle's got a personal score to settle with a rancher out this way. Said it wasn't just business anymore, not for him. Said he means to make an example of it, whatever that means. I know, he paid me a visit himself." Walter's face went pale. "Here?" "This afternoon." "Caleb." Walter's voice cracked slightly, something raw underneath it that Caleb had never heard from him before. "I've spent weeks telling you to be careful of the wrong kind of stranger. Never once thought to warn you about the one already wearing a familiar face. Why are you here, Walter? Walter was quiet a long moment. When he spoke again, the words came slower, like each one cost him something. Because I've known you 8 years, he said. And in 8 years, I've never once seen you make a choice I couldn't understand, even when I disagreed with it. That day fed to those travelers, I called you soft. Meant it too at the time. He shook his head slowly. Wasn't soft, was it? Was just decent. Something this whole territory's forgotten how to be most days. Caleb didn't answer right away. Truth is, Walter went on, I've been turning it over since. All my talk about chasing off strangers, deciding quick who counts as danger. Never once stopped to ask myself what kind of man that turns me into, deciding so fast, so sure of myself. Boyle's the kind of danger I was always warning you about. Wore the wrong face for me to see it coming. You couldn't have known. Maybe not. Still sits wrong with me. Walter looked down at his hat again. I've got a rifle and 40 years of stubbornness, Caleb. Not much else to offer, but it's yours if you'll have it. Boyle's got near 20 men now, Walter continued after a moment. Maybe more by week's end. He's not hiding what he means to do, not really. Man like that doesn't hide. Just waits for the moment it'll hurt the most. How much time do I have? Don't know. Days maybe. Not weeks. Walter met his eyes, steady despite everything. I can tell you I'll stand with you if it comes to that. Whatever that's worth from a man who spent a month telling you to be afraid of the wrong thing. Something eased in Caleb's chest just slightly, at that. Not enough to erase the fear sitting there. Enough to make it bearable. It's worth something, Caleb said. Worth a lot, actually. Walter nodded once, sharp, like a man settling a debt he'd been carrying too long. He didn't leave right away, though. Stood there a moment longer, hat still in his hands, and then set it down on the table like a man deciding to stay a while after all. Show me the ground, he said, while there's still lamp enough to see it by. They walked the property together, the two of them, lantern light, swinging low across dirt and fence and the dark shapes of the barn. Walter had fought in the war too, briefly, before a wound sent him home early, and something in him seemed to wake up out here in the dark, some old soldier's habit surfacing the same way it had surfaced in Caleb weeks before. Barn gives you cover, Walter said, studying the angles. But it's a box. Only one door in, one door out. You get pinned in there, that's the end of it. Was already planning to fight from the house. House is better. Windows on 3 sides at least. Still leaves your north approach wide open though. Walter pointed toward the low rise beyond the well. Man with a rifle up there could pick you off before you ever saw him coming. Noticed that myself. We'll need to give you eyes on it then. Something that catches the light or makes noise if a horse comes through. Walter rubbed his jaw, thinking, I've got some old cans back at my place. String them along that rise, quiet as we can manage. Won't stop anybody. Might buy you a few seconds of warning, though. Sometimes a few seconds is the whole difference. Appreciate it, Walter. Don't thank me yet, Walter said. Thank me after, if there's an after to thank me in. It wasn't much of a joke. Neither of them laughed at it. But something passed between them anyway. Standing there in the dark, with a lantern between them and 20 riders. Somewhere out in the night, the particular wordless understanding of 2 men who had decided, each in his own time, which side of this they meant to stand on. Get some rest if you can, Walter said finally, turning for the door. Don't figure either of us will get much once this starts in earnest. Caleb stood alone in the doorway, long after Walter's horse had faded into the dark, the letter from Ruth still folded in his shirt pocket, the memory of Boyle's smile still sitting cold in his chest. He thought about Toya, about the peaceful wait of that evening weeks back, the fire, the quiet, the old man's hand pressed flat against his heart. Wondered, distantly, foolishly, whether that family had made it safely wherever they were going. Wondered if he'd ever know. He thought too about Chody's shoulder, about Ituha's fierce protective grip on the boy's arm, about the quiet dignity all 4 of them had carried even in exhaustion. Whatever ground they'd walked that evening, whatever village had once stood there before Boyle's men, rode through it, burning everything they could reach, none of it existed anymore. He understood that now, fully in a way, he hadn't quite let himself understand it 3 weeks back. They weren't running from an old danger. They were running from him. From Emmett Boyle specifically, the same man now sitting his horse at Caleb's own fence line, promising nothing directly and meaning everything by it. Which meant Caleb wasn't just defending fences and cattle anymore. He was standing, however unknowingly, in the same path Boyle had already carved through people who'd done nothing to deserve it, and he understood, sitting alone in the lamplight, that there was no way left to pretend this was only about him. Before dawn, unable to sit still any longer, He walked out past the garden to the grave marker he'd carved himself 5 years back. Knelt there in the dark, the way he had 100 mornings before. Except this time the words came easier than they had in longer than he could remember. "Don't know if you can hear any of this," he said quiet to the stone. "Don't know if it matters whether you can. But I read your letter.
Understand now what you were carrying all that time, same as I'd been carrying my own.
Wish you'd told me. Wish I'd been the kind of man who made it easy to tell." The wind moved through the garden, soft, indifferent. "Man's coming," he went on. "One I knew a long time ago. Means to take everything I've built, maybe take me along with it. I'm scared, if I'm honest. Haven't said that out loud in years." He pressed a hand flat against the cool stone. "But I did right by those travelers, same as you did right by yours. Whatever comes of that, I won't take it back. Figured you'd want to know that much at least." He knelt there a while longer, the sky beginning to lighten behind the mountains, and then stood, brushed the dirt from his knees the way he always did, and walked back toward the house steadier than he'd felt in days. Dawn came without him ever having closed his eyes. He sat at the table instead, lamp still burning though the window had begun to gray, rifle within reach, listening to every sound the desert made, and finding none of them innocent anymore, because something was coming. He could feel it now, not as a vague pressure in the air the way he'd felt it weeks ago, but as something with a name, a face, a decade-old grudge riding toward him on 20 horses he couldn't yet see. He didn't know exactly when it would arrive, only that it would, and that whatever kindness he'd offered a family of strangers weeks ago, whatever debt Toya had spoken of that didn't need to be about owing, none of it would matter in the end unless he found a way to still be standing when it finally did. The riders came on the fourth night. Caleb felt it before he saw it, a change in the air the way animals feel weather in turn long before any cloud shows itself. The horses in the barn shifted uneasy in their stalls. The wind died down to nothing and then nothing at all, the whole desert holding its breath along with him. He'd spent the day the way he'd spent the 3 before it, checking the barricades, counting cartridges he already knew the count of, walking the property with Walter at his side, the two of them speaking less each day, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some kinds of waiting didn't leave room for talk. Walter had moved into the barn 2 nights back, brought his own rifle, his own blanket, a jar of his wife's preserves he set on the table without comment, like a man leaving something behind on purpose in case he didn't come back to collect it. Neither of them said that part out loud. Didn't need to. Dusk came slow and orange, the mountains catching fire the way they did every evening in this country, indifferent to whatever waited beneath them. Caleb stood on the porch and watched the light fade, rifle across his knees, and thought about all the ordinary evenings he'd spent on this exact spot, doing nothing more dangerous than finishing a cup of coffee. Seemed like a different life already. Except it wasn't a different life. It was the same one, only now with a name attached to the danger instead of a vague shape. Emmett Boyle. A decade-old grudge riding toward him on however many horses he'd finally managed to gather. Walter came out from the barn as the last light died, rifle in hand, moving with the careful economy of a man who had done this kind of waiting before, in another country, another war, and had never quite unlearned the habit of readiness. "Cans are strung," Walter said. "North rise, both sides of the wash.
Might get
10 seconds if a horse catches one. Wrong 10 seconds is something. 10 seconds is everything. Out here." Walter settled onto the porch step, laid his rifle across his lap. "You scared?" Caleb considered lying. "Didn't, yes." "Good," Walter said. "Man who isn't scared tonight isn't paying attention." They sat together in the deepening dark, the stars arriving one by one overhead. Indifferent and enormous, the same stars that had watched 100 years of men doing exactly this kind of waiting in exactly this kind of country. Caleb thought about Ruth, about the small quiet courage it had taken her to do the same thing he'd done, years before he ever found out about it. He thought too of the promise Toya had made without words, one he'd never quite understood the weight of until tonight. He thought too about the 11 boards above his bed, and wondered, with a coldness that surprised him, whether he'd ever count them again. Stop that, he told himself. Just stop. Except stopping wasn't something fear ever did on command. It just sat there, patient, waiting its own turn to speak. He checked his rifle again. 3rd time in an hour. Nothing had changed about it since the last check. Nothing would change until it mattered, and yet his hands kept finding their way back to it anyway, the way hands do when they need something to hold on to besides the waiting itself. Walter's breathing beside him had gone slow, and even, though Caleb doubted he was actually asleep, just resting his eyes, conserving whatever he had left for, whenever the night finally decided to stop pretending it might pass quietly. Because it wouldn't. Caleb knew that the way he knew weather, the way he knew land, the way 3 years of scouting had silence for what it was hiding underneath. And till a coyote called someone past the ridge, and every muscle in his body went rigid at once. False alarm. Just a coyote. Same as any other night. Except how would he know? Except how would anyone know, out here in this particular dark, whether the next sound was ordinary desert business or the first small warning of everything he'd spent 3 days dreading? He made himself breathe slower. In, hold. Out. Ruth used to do that for him, back when the war still visited him some nights. In dreams he never fully explained to her. Just breathe, Caleb. In, hold. Out. Whatever's coming will still be coming after you've caught your breath. No sense meeting it already exhausted. He missed her in that specific way just then. Not the general ache that lived in him most days. Something sharper. Something that wished, fiercely, foolishly, that she could be here now, steady hand on his shoulder, telling him it would be all right, even if neither of them could know for certain that it would. Near midnight, the first can rattled. Faint. Distant. Easy to miss if a man wasn't listening for exactly that sound with every nerve he had left. Caleb heard it anyway. He was on his feet before the second can rattled, rifle already rising, every old instinct from the war flooding back into his hands like they'd never actually left. Walter rose beside him, silent, the two of them moving toward their positions without needing to discuss the plan they'd already walked through a dozen times. Dust rose along the northern ridge. Dark shapes against darker sky, more of them than Caleb had let himself imagine even in his worst calculations these past 3 days. He counted anyway. Old habit. 10, 12, 15. More still coming over the rise behind the first wave, torches catching now, flickering orange against a night that had been perfectly peacefully black only minutes before. His mouth went dry. Because 15 was already more than he and Walter could hope to hold off for long, and there were more behind them. And somewhere in that mass of riders and torchlight was a man who'd spent a decade nursing a grudge into something with teeth. The riders spread out, slow, deliberate, surrounding the ranch from 3 sides the way a noose surrounds a throat before it ever tightens. A single rider broke away from the rest, walked his horse forward, unhurried, until he sat just beyond the fence line, torchlight catching the familiar shape of his face. Whitfield, Emmett Boyle called out, voice carrying easy across the still night air. Figured you'd still be up. Man like you doesn't sleep easy, not with what's coming. Caleb didn't answer. Held his position behind the porch rail, rifle steady, heart anything but. Open the gate, Boyle said. Hand over what's yours peaceful, and maybe you live long enough to see morning. Fight it, and morning comes anyway, just without you in it. Silence answered him. The kind of presses down on a man's chest until breathing itself feels like a decision. Boyle laughed, low, unbothered. Suit yourself. He raised one hand, and the night exploded. The first volley tore through the dark like something physical, splinters, flying off the porch rail inches from Caleb's shoulder. He dropped low, returned fire toward the muzzle flashes along the ridge, and felt the old rhythm of it come back to him whether he wanted it or not. Aim, breathe, fire, move, because that was the only rhythm that kept a man alive in this kind of night. Walter's rifle cracked from the barn loft, steady, methodical, each shot placed with the care of a man who understood exactly how limited his ammunition really was. A rider went down near the wash, horse screaming, chaos rippling outward from the fall. 2 down my side, Walter called. Keep count, Caleb shouted back. We'll need it. Except counting felt obscene even as he did it. Counting men the way you counted cattle, except these were men, however wrong the reasons had brought them here, and some part of him flinched every time another shape crumpled in the torchlight. No time for that. No time for anything except the next shot, the next breath, the next flash of movement, along a ridge that seemed to hold more riders than he'd counted the first time, more than should have physically been possible. A bullet tore through the porch post beside his head, close enough to feel the heat of it, close enough that his ears rang with something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite sound either. He fired back, missed, fired again, hit something. A shape fell from a horse near the gate, and Caleb didn't let himself look at it long enough to know whether it was a man he recognized or a stranger entirely. Riders wheeled and circled, breaking formation now, some peeling off toward the barn where Walter held his position, others pressing closer along the fence line, where Caleb crouched behind what little cover the porch still offered. Smoke drifted thick across the yard, catching torchlight, turning the whole scene into something half-lit and unreal, the kind of chaos a mansman struggled to organize into anything as simple as before and after. A shout went up near the barn. Walter's voice, sharp with something new. "Caleb!" He turned in time to see two riders bearing down on the barn from the blind side, the angle Walter hadn't been able to cover from his loft. Caleb fired without fully aiming, more instinct than calculation, and one horse reared hard enough to throw its rider clear before either man reached the barn wall. The other kept coming. Caleb's rifle clicked on an empty chamber at the worst possible moment, and for one long, suspended second he simply stood there, weapon useless in his hands, watching a stranger's horse close the last 20 yards toward the man who'd become, over these past weeks, something closer to family than neighbor. Walter's own shot rang out first. The rider went down hard, horse veering off riderless into the dark, and Walter slumped back against the loft rail, breathing ragged, having spent one more of his dwindling rounds on a shot that had, this time, bought them both another few minutes of borrowed time. "You good?" Caleb called. "Good enough," Walter answered, though something in his voice had thinned considerably since the fighting started. Minutes passed like hours, or maybe hours passed like minutes. Time had stopped meaning anything specific the moment the first shot cracked the night open, and Caleb found himself moving on instinct alone, reloading with hands that had gone steady in the particular way. Hands go steady when there's no longer room for anything, except the task directly in front of them, until his rifle clicked empty, until he reached for another cartridge and found his pocket already bare. He froze for one terrible second, the whole night narrowing down to that single small fact: no more bullets, riders still coming. Walter's rifle still cracking somewhere behind him, but slower now, further apart, the unmistakable rhythm of a man running low himself. "Walter," he called. "Ammunition, getting thin." Walter's voice strained, further away than it should have been. 6 rounds. Maybe 7. 6 rounds. Against however many riders still circled the ranch in the dark. Caleb's chest tightened with something colder than fear. Something closer to certainty. The particular terrible clarity that comes when a man finally understands, without any remaining doubt, that the math simply doesn't work in his favor. He pressed himself flat against the porch boards, empty rifle useless in his hands, and felt something in him start to unravel at the edges. This is it then. Don't think that. Thinking it makes it true. Except thinking had nothing to do with truth out here. Bullets didn't care what a man believed about his own odds. He thought of Ruth's letter, still folded against his chest. Thought of Toya's hand pressed flat over his heart, weeks ago, in a different world entirely. Debts are not always about owing. Except what good was a debt unpaid, he thought. Bitter, half hysterical with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting for his life for the better part of an hour. What good was any of it, if this was how the night ended? If this was get up, move, find something, anything. He crawled toward the door, some last stubborn instinct dragging him forward, even as his mind kept circling the same useless calculations. A knife in the kitchen. Not much against a rifle, but better than nothing. Better than just kneeling here waiting for a scream cut through the darkness. Not his. Not Walter's. One of Boyle's men, somewhere near the ridge, shouting something Caleb couldn't make out over the ringing in his own ears. He risked a look, and felt the whole night tilt sideways into something he hadn't dared hope for. Horses. Dozens of them, pouring down off the western ridge in a formation too tight, too disciplined, to be anything but deliberate. Torchlight from Boyle's own men caught the shapes of riders moving with a speed and precision that turned the chaos of the siege into something else entirely not a battle anymore, but a trap closing. Because they weren't riding toward the ranch. They were riding around it, around Boyle's men. Circling the circlers, the hunters becoming, in the space of a few impossible seconds, the hunted. An old man's voice rose above the gunfire, sharp, commanding, calling out words Caleb didn't understand but recognized instantly all the same, recognized the particular cadence of a leader directing his people through chaos with absolute calm. Toya. Caleb's knees nearly buckled with the force of it. Relief and disbelief tangled together, so completely he couldn't have separated them if his life depended on it, which he understood distantly, it very much still did. Boyle's men, caught between the ranch and this sudden overwhelming reversal, began to scatter. Some fired wildly into the dark, panicked, no longer aiming at anything specific. Others simply turned and ran, horses screaming. The whole formation Boyle had built with such careful confidence collapsing into chaos within minutes. Caleb caught sight of a young rider near the front of the Apache formation, moving with a fierce, unmistakable energy despite the sling still visible strapped across his chest beneath his jacket. Chody. Healed enough, apparently, to ride. Healed enough to fight for the man who'd once bandaged his shoulder beneath a cottonwood tree. Beside him, unmistakable even in the chaos, rode Atuha, her fierce protective bearing from weeks ago now channeled into something sharper, more purposeful. She fought not with wild fury, but with the same careful, deliberate economy Caleb remembered from her tending Choshi's wound. Every motion measured, nothing wasted. A woman who had already decided, somewhere in the space of her own private grief, exactly what she was, and was not willing to lose again. Caleb watched it all from behind the porch rail, rifle still empty and useless in his hands, and felt something enormous move through his chest. Not relief exactly. Something closer to awe. The particular overwhelming disbelief of watching a debt he'd never once expected repaid arrive at precisely the moment it mattered most. The battle, if it could still be called that, didn't last much longer. Boyle's men broke first at the edges. Then all at once, the particular contagious panic of men who'd only ever fought when the odds favored them clearly and suddenly found those odds reversed. Riders fled into the dark in every direction, pursued only far enough to ensure they wouldn't regroup, Toya's people showing a discipline that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with simply finishing what needed finishing. Only Boyle remained. Caleb saw him near the gate, alone now, his men scattered or fallen around him, torchlight guttering low in a torch someone had dropped in the chaos. He dismounted, stood with his rifle raised, chest heaving, the particular wild-eyed look of a man watching every plan he'd ever made collapse in real time. "Whitfield," Boyle shouted, voice cracking with something that wasn't quite fear yet but was getting close. "This isn't finished." Caleb stepped down from the porch, empty rifle useless in his hands now, but he carried it anyway because a man's hands needed something to hold even when the thing they held could no longer help him. "It is, though," Caleb said. "Quiet. Certain. Look around you, Emmett. It's already finished. You think this changes anything? Think a handful of Apache riding to your rescue makes you the hero of this story? Watch your words, Emmett. Why? What's left to lose by saying them?" Boyle's laugh had gone ragged, unhinged at the edges. "You reported me once for less than that. Look where it's gotten either of us." "It's gotten me a ranch and a reason to get up every morning," Caleb said. "Gotten you 15 dead men and a grudge you've spent 10 years feeding instead of living your life. Doesn't seem like much of a trade when you look at it plain. Don't you dare pity me." "Wasn't pity," Caleb said. "It was just the truth. You could have walked away from that column a different man, Emmett. Chose this instead. That's on you. Always was. Never wanted to be anybody's hero," Caleb went on, quieter now. "Just wanted to be the kind of man who could sleep easy afterward. Looks like I might get that after all." Boyle's jaw worked, rage and desperation warring across a face that had lost, in the space of one impossible hour, every advantage he'd spent weeks building. "Then I'll make sure you never do," he said and raised his rifle. The shot that ended it came from behind Caleb, not from him. Walter, staggering out of the barn with blood soaking one sleeve, his own rifle raised with hands that shouldn't have still been steady enough to aim, let alone fire. Boyle went down before his own shot ever left the barrel. The night went suddenly, completely silent, the kind of silence that follows violence the way still water follows a stone thrown into it, spreading outward, gradually, until it swallows everything. Caleb stood over Boyle's body a long moment, waiting for triumph to arrive, for some clean, satisfying sense of justice finally served. It didn't come. Only a tired, hollow ache, and the distant, unwelcome memory of a young lieutenant's between angry men and bound prisoners, insisting that killing men who could no longer fight back wasn't soldiering at all. He hadn't wanted this ending exactly. Had wanted, if he was honest with himself, some version of Boyle that could have been talked back from the edge he'd spent a decade walking toward. There hadn't been one. Some men walked too far to be called back. He turned away from the body, found he couldn't look at it any longer than that. Caleb crossed to Walter first, catching him as his knees finally buckled. "Walter, just my arm," Walter managed, though his voice had gone thin, strained, caught one early on. "Didn't want to say, in case it worried you into doing something foolish." "Foolish like what?" "Like getting yourself killed trying to protect me instead of yourself." Walter's attempt at a smile came out closer to a grimace. "Wouldn't have been a fair trade, Caleb. Wanted you to have better odds than that." Caleb didn't have words for what moved through him hearing that. Just held Walter steady. One hand pressed hard against the wound to slow the bleeding, and looked up to find Toya already dismounting nearby, moving toward them with the same unhurried, deliberate calm he'd carried weeks ago beneath a cottonwood tree. "He needs a doctor," Toya said, kneeling beside Walter, assessing the wound with hands that clearly knew more of this work than Caleb's own limited skill. Sella carries what is needed for now, but this should be seen properly when there is time. There's a doctor in Dry Wells, Caleb said. Hours ride, then we ride, Toya said simply. Sella appeared at his side almost before he finished speaking, already working, hands moving with the same careful competence. Caleb remembered from 3 weeks back, mending torn cloth beside a fire that felt now like it belonged to some entirely different lifetime. Chody dismounted nearby, favoring his healing shoulder, but standing steady on his own feet, and looked around at the scattered wreckage of Boyle's attack. With an expression Caleb couldn't quite read, something between grim satisfaction and simple, exhausted relief. You came, Caleb said. It wasn't quite a question. He wasn't sure what it was. Told you, Toya said. Debs are not always about owing. He straightened, looking out at the retreating dust where Boyle's scattered men had fled into the dark. But this was never only about a debt, Caleb Whitfield. This man burned our village, took what he wanted, and left nothing behind but ash and grief. We had reasons of our own to see this night end the way it did. How did you know? Caleb managed. How did you know to come tonight specifically? Toya's expression shifted, something almost gentle beneath the exhaustion. We have watched this man for weeks. Scouts, moving quiet, further than you would think to look. When he gathered his riders 3 nights back, we knew where he meant to point them. He met Caleb's eyes steadily. We were already coming before your friend's rifle ever fired the first shot. Would have come, regardless of whether you fed us that afternoon weeks ago. Then why because where danger points is not the same as choosing to stand in front of it, Toya said. That choice we made freely, for our own reasons. And because of what you did, that afternoon at your gate when every voice around you said to turn us away. Dawn arrived gray and quiet over a ranch that looked, in the pale early light, like a battlefield trying very hard to remember it, had once been an ordinary home. Bullet holes scarred the porch rail. Blood stained the dirt near the gate, dark and already drying. 2 of Boyle's men lay where they'd fallen, and Caleb found he couldn't look at either of them for very long. Sheriff Boone arrived an hour after sunrise, 3 deputies behind him, his face doing something complicated when he took in the scene, relief and guilt tangled together in equal measure. Got word too late, he said. Ryder came in near dawn saying shots had been heard out this way. I'm sorry, Caleb. Should have gotten here faster. Wouldn't have mattered, Caleb said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it without bitterness. Help arrived. Just not from where either of us expected it. Boone's eyes moved to where Toya stood with his people, tending to the last of their preparations before the ride toward town with Walter, and something shifted in the sheriff's face, the particular, quiet reckoning of a man revising an old assumption in real time. I spent a month telling folks to be wary of exactly the wrong kind of danger, Boone said, half to himself. Spent chasing rumors about people who never once threatened anybody in this territory, while the real threat rode straight past every warning I put out. Wasn't just you, Boone. Doesn't make it easier to sit with. Boone took off his hat, ran a hand through hair gone gray at the temples faster than a man his age should have earned. Seems I owe somebody a debt of my own then. Seems like a lot of us do, Caleb answered. He told Boone the rest of it then, standing in the pale morning light with the yard, smelling of gunsmoke and blood, the supply column, the executed prisoner, the report he'd filed a decade back that had cost Boyle everything and, in some roundabout way, had cost Caleb almost everything too, all these years later. Boone listened without interrupting, the way a good lawman learns to listen, taking the whole shape of it in before offering judgment. You couldn't have known it would come back around like this, Boone said when Caleb finished. No, but I'd do the same thing again, knowing what I know now. Reporting him wasn't the wrong choice. Boone, just because it cost me something later doesn't make it wrong. No, Boone agreed. Doesn't. Wanted you to have the whole truth. Boone clasped his shoulder, briefly. An unfamiliar gesture from a man usually careful about keeping his distance. Appreciate that, more than you know. He looked out at the yard, at Toya's people still gathering their things, at Walter propped against the wagon with Sela's careful hands still tending him. Seems this territory's got a lot of old wounds it hasn't finished dealing with, yours. Boyle's. Whatever fear's been sitting in this town for longer than either of us has been wearing a badge. Takes time, Caleb said. Takes people willing to spend it, Boone said. Reckon you've spent more of yours on that than most. He walked the yard slowly while Boone's deputies began the grim work of accounting for what the night had cost, stepping carefully around the places where the fighting had been fiercest, the ground itself still telling a story he wasn't sure he'd ever fully make peace with. Some of the men who'd fallen were strangers he'd never see again outside of memory. That didn't make looking at them any easier. War teaches a man that lesson early, if it teaches him anything worth keeping. Winning doesn't erase what winning costs. They rode into dry wells together that morning, an unlikely procession. Caleb, Walter propped carefully in the wagon bed with Sella tending his arm, Boone and his deputies, and behind them, keeping a respectful distance but riding all the same, Toya and Chody and Ituha, escorting the wounded man as far as the edge of town would allow. The town watched them come in silence. Caleb saw the same faces he'd seen 100 times before: the storekeeper, the woman from the mercantile who'd spoken so carelessly weeks back, the 2 young men who'd cornered an old traveler near the water trough. He watched their expressions shift as the procession passed, watched suspicion curdle slowly into something more complicated, something closer to shame. Nobody said much. Some things didn't need saying out loud to be understood. The doctor took Walter in immediately, and Caleb waited outside with the others while the town slowly gathered at a respectful distance, watching the small group of Apache riders with an unfamiliar mixture of caution and something that might, given enough time, eventually grow into something better. Toya didn't linger long. Some fears he seemed to understand without needing it explained took longer than a single morning to fully unwind. "We will go now," he said, when the doctor confirmed Walter would recover cleanly, the bullet having missed anything vital. "Wait," Caleb said. "Before you go." He reached into his shirt pocket, where Ruth's letter still sat folded and worn, and for a moment considered showing it to Toya, explaining the whole strange circle of it: his wife's secret kindness, his own choice weeks later, the way one quiet act had somehow reached forward through years to save his life. Decided against it. Some things belonged only to him and to her memory. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for everything." "I don't have words big enough for it." Toya studied him a long moment, then reached into a pouch at his belt and drew out something small, worn smooth with age, a leather medicine pouch, hand-stitched, decorated along its edge with careful beadwork that told a story Caleb couldn't read but recognized instantly as something precious. "This belonged to my father," Toya said, placing it carefully into Caleb's hands, "and his father before him. It is meant to protect the one who carries it, and the family around him." He closed Caleb's fist gently around it. "I give it to you not because you are owed a gift, because you are, I think, already part of what it is meant to protect." Caleb's throat tightened too much to answer properly. "I don't know if I've earned something like this," he managed finally. "Earning is a strange for kindness," Toya said, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth. "You did not ask what you would earn that afternoon at your gate, only what was needed. That is exactly why you deserve to carry this now." Sella stepped forward next, resting a weathered hand briefly against Caleb's arm. "Bring your bread by sometime," she said. "I will correct it again, free of charge." Something that might have been the first real laugh Caleb had managed in days broke loose at that. "I'll hold you to it." Chody offered his good hand this time, shoulder-heeled enough now to make the gesture without wincing. "We are even now," he said, "though I think perhaps that is not the right word either." "No," Caleb agreed. "Debs and evens. Neither one quite fits what this turned out to be." Ituha lingered last. The same fierce spring look from weeks ago softened now into something warmer, something closer to friendship, fully arrived rather than merely beginning. "You saw us that first day," she said. "Not as danger. Not as strangers to be feared, just as people, hungry and tired, deserving the same water anyone deserves." She glanced toward Chody, toward the whole small, exhausted, victorious group gathered around them. "Because of that, more of us are alive tonight than would otherwise be. That is not a small thing, Caleb Whitfield. Do not let anyone convince you it was." "Your husband," Caleb said carefully, remembering what Sella had told him weeks back. "I'm sorry you didn't get to see this night with him." Something crossed Itua's face, old grief surfacing briefly before she steadied it, the way she seemed to steady everything. "I think of him tonight more than most nights," she admitted. "He did not run fast enough the night we lost our home. I have carried that a long time, wondering if I could have pulled him along faster, done something differently. Grief asks those questions whether we want it to or not," Caleb said. "Took me years to stop answering them." "Did you ever stop?" "Mostly," Caleb said. "Some mornings it still asks anyway." Ituha nodded slowly, something like recognition passing between them, two people who understood, in their own separate ways, exactly how long certain kinds of loss took to settle into something a person could carry without it crushing them entirely. Tonight, at least, She said grief did not win. That has to count for something too. It does, Caleb said. It really does. Weeks passed differently after that. Word of the night at Whitfield's ranch spread through Dry Wells, the way word always spread out here, fast and imperfect, and gradually settling into something closer to the truth than the fear that had come before it. Some ranchers remained wary. Old habits, Caleb had come to understand, rarely unwound as quickly as a single dramatic night might suggest they should, but something had shifted all the same. Toya's people began passing through more openly after that, trading goods at the edge of town, no longer forced to keep entirely to the shadows, the way fear had once required of them. Caleb rode out to visit when he could, and Sela, more often than not, corrected the shape of whatever bread he'd brought along with 2 fingers in the same quiet verdict. Better. They struck an arrangement, eventually the kind neither of them dressed up with grand language because it didn't need any. Caleb had cattle enough to spare a portion each season, now that the ranch was rebuilding steadier than it had been in years. Toya's people in turn brought hides, woven goods, medicines gathered from country. Caleb had never learned to read the way they did plants that eased a fever, roots that closed a wound cleaner than anything the doctor in town kept on his shelf. Small trades. Nothing that would make either of them wealthy. Everything that mattered all the same. The first time Toya's people rode openly into Dry Wells itself, leading horses loaded with hides bound for the trading post, the street had gone quiet the way it always seemed to go quiet around them. But Caleb had been there that day, standing outside the mercantile, and he'd crossed the street to walk alongside Toya the last stretch to the post, not because it was necessary, but because he understood, by then, exactly what a small gesture like that could still mean to people whose safety had once depended entirely on the goodwill of strangers. A few other ranchers nodded as they passed. Not many. Enough to notice. Enough, Caleb thought, to matter. Walter healed slow but clean, the arm stiff in cold weather ever after, though he never once complained about the cost of it. He and Caleb worked the ranch together more regular now, an understanding grown between them that hadn't existed before that long. Oh, terrible night, the particular bond of men who had stood shoulder to shoulder when it mattered most, and found each other worth standing beside. Still soft, Walter told him once, months later, watching Caleb load a wagon with supplies bound for Toya's village. Set it with a grin this time, though, nothing left of the old warning underneath it. Guess I am, Caleb said. Turned out fine, though. Didn't it? Turned out better than fine, Walter admitted. Wish I'd learned that lesson without needing a bullet in my arm to teach it, but I suppose some lessons only stick that way. Boone made good, eventually, on the debt he'd mentioned that first morning, quietly working to ensure the territory's fear settled into something more like fairness. Slow work, necessary all the same. And through it all, the ranch kept doing what ranches did, asking to be tended, one ordinary day following another. Late that autumn, on an afternoon that carried the same particular gold light as the one that had started all of this, Caleb was mending fence along the west line when his horse lifted its head, ears forward, and snorted toward the ridge. He straightened, looked west. A single wagon this time, not travelers on foot. A young family by the looks of it, axle broken, standing beside their stalled rig with the particular helpless posture of people a long way from anywhere and unsure whether the next stranger they met would help or harm them. Caleb didn't reach for his rifle. Didn't hesitate at all. In fact, walking toward them with the same easy certainty that had felt, months back, like the hardest decision of his life, and now felt like nothing more than simply who he'd become. "Trouble with your axle?" he called out, still some distance off. The father straightened, wary, one hand instinctively finding his wife's shoulder. "We don't want any trouble, mister. Just passing through." "Didn't say you did. A broken axle. I've got tools and a spare hour. Figured I'd offer, is all." The wariness held a moment longer, then slowly eased. "We'd be grateful," the man said. Caleb smiled, the particular smile of a man who understood better than most exactly how much weight those 3 small words could carry. "Water first," he said. "Then we'll see about that axle." He thought, walking back toward the well, of an old man's hand pressed flat against his chest, months back now, of bread shared beneath a cottonwood tree, of a debt that had never really been about owing at all. Some circles, he was coming to understand, simply kept turning. Once a person finally let one begin, and by the time he'd fixed the axle and sent the family on their way, the light had gone the particular gold. It went to the last hour before evening. The same light that had been falling the afternoon before. Strangers first crossed his land. He didn't go inside when they'd gone. Walked out past the garden instead, To the grave marker he'd carved himself 5 years back, the medicine pouch Toya had given him still tucked in his coat pocket where he'd taken to keeping it. Caleb kept the medicine pouch close these days. Not hidden away in a trunk the way Ruth's letters had been hidden for years, waiting for someone to finally find them. Kept it where he could reach it, where it could remind him, on the ordinary mornings that kept arriving, of everything a single afternoon's kindness had set into motion. He knelt in the dirt beside her marker now, turning the pouch over slowly in his hands, tracing the careful beadwork with his thumb the way he might once have traced the words in her letter. "Wish you could have met them properly," he told her, sun climbing slow over mountains that had watched over this land longer than either of them, longer than any of the fear or fighting that had briefly, violently passed through it. "Think you would have liked Sela's bread better than mine. Everybody does." The wind moved soft through the garden, same as always, indifferent and constant. "Started something, you know," he said. "That family you helped all those years back. Never knew it would come around like this. Never knew kindness could travel that far, that long, and still know exactly where to land when it mattered most." He looked out at the fence line, at the well, at the exact patch of ground where 4 exhausted strangers had once stood with their hands raised, asking for nothing more than water. And now not an hour passed where a different family entirely had stood asking for nothing more than the same small mercy answered, this time without a moment's hesitation. "5 years I sat with just missing you," he said. "Quieter now. Didn't know there was a way to keep loving you that didn't just hurt. Turns out there was. Turns out you'd already shown me the way, and I just needed a reason to notice." He pressed his palm flat against the cool stone. "Rest easy," he said. "I've got this from here." He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and walked back toward a house that no longer felt entirely empty. No matter how many mornings he woke there alone, because somewhere out past the western ridge, in a village being slowly rebuilt with borrowed cattle and shared labor, and the particular stubbornness of people who refused to let violence have the final word, 4 people carried a piece of him now the same way he carried a piece of them. People remember bullets, Toya had told him once, at a fence line on a fading spring evening a lifetime ago. But bread, shared freely in a stranger's hour of hunger, traveled further than any bullet ever could. It found its way home. Every single time, even here, even now, even across the widest, most unforgiving stretch of frontier a person could imagine. Kindness always finds its way home.